The maître did not even look at the reservation book. He looked at the man standing in the doorway, at the little girl holding his hand, at the plain gray coat and the worn leather shoes, and he made his decision before a single word was spoken. "This is a private establishment," he said. "I think you have the wrong address." The man did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He looked down at his daughter, whose small fingers had tightened around his, and he said only, "We had a reservation." "Under Bennett." The maître smiled the way people smile when they are enjoying themselves. "I don't see a Bennett on my list." Behind him, in the warm gold light of the dining room, forks paused over plates. Conversations dimmed just enough for the silence to become its own kind of noise. Nobody said anything. Nobody moved to help. They watched the way people watch weather through a window, safe and detached, as if this were happening on the other side of glass. If you've ever been looked at and seen only what someone assumed about you and not who you actually were, stay with this one until the end. Because what happened next in that dining room is the reason this story is still being told. 10 weeks earlier, Marcus Bennett was standing in his kitchen at 6 in the morning, flipping pancakes with one hand and braiding his daughter's hair with the other, which is to say, badly and with great patience. "Dad, it's crooked. It's artistic. It's crooked." Amara Bennett was 7 years old and had the particular gift of children who grow up with only one parent, which is to say, she noticed everything. She noticed when her father was tired. She noticed when he pretended not to be. She noticed this particular morning that he kept checking his phone between flips of the pancake. "Al, is it the restaurant thing?" Marcus set the spatula down. "It's a job. Just a job." It was not just a job, and both of them knew it. Marcus Bennett had spent 18 years in professional kitchen. He had worked his way up from a dish pit in Cleveland to sous chef in Chicago to, for 3 years, head of a small 4-table restaurant in Detroit that critics had begun to notice right before the building's owner sold the property out from under him. He had raised Amara alone since she was 2, after her mother's death, cooking family meals at odd hours around catering gigs and private chef work, the kind of unglamorous, competent labor that keeps a life running without ever making headlines. He had applied on something between a whim and a calculated risk for the head chef position at Lumen, the new flagship restaurant of the Halston Group, a hospitality company that had been buying up city blocks of real estate and turning them into the kind of restaurants that got written about in magazines. Marcus had never been able to afford. He had not expected a callback. He had gotten one anyway from a man named Gerald Voss, the Halston Group's regional director of restaurant operations, who ran the interview like a man conducting a transaction he had already decided the outcome of. "Your resume is impressive," Voss had said, not looking up from it. Detroit. "Small operation, though. We're talking about 140 covers a night here. Michelin ambitions. Can you handle that kind of pressure?" "I've run kitchens under worse conditions with fewer resources," Marcus said. "Pressure's not new to me." Voss had smiled, the same practiced hollow smile the maître d' would wear 10 weeks later. "We'll be in touch." They had not been in touch. Not for 3 weeks, and by then Marcus had assumed, correctly as it turned out, that Voss had already decided to hire someone else. A chef named Adrian Cole, whose primary qualification, as far as Marcus could later determine, was that his uncle sat on the Halston Group's board. What Marcus did not know, what nobody serving food at Lumen that autumn knew, was that the actual owner of the Halston Group, a woman named Eleanor Halston, who had inherited the company from her father 4 years earlier, and had spent most of that time in near total isolation from its day-to-day operations, had personally flagged his application before it ever reached Voss's desk. She had eaten his food once, 3 years earlier, at his 4-table restaurant in Detroit, on a night she had told no one she was attending. She had ordered the braised short rib and a glass of Burgundy, and had sat alone at a corner table, and she had not forgotten it. Eleanor Halston did not often forget things. She had simply in the intervening years been busy surviving the transition of running a company that her father had built, and that several men within it seemed to believe they had built instead. Gerald Voss was one of those men. He had been with the Halston Group for 11 years, long enough to consider himself indispensable. 2, long enough to have quietly arranged over time a network of favors and appointments that kept his authority intact, regardless of who sat at the top. Hiring Adrian Cole was, on its surface, nepotism. Underneath it was something closer to insurance. Cole's uncle sat on the board. Cole owed Voss his job. And Voss, who had spent a decade learning exactly how much a restaurant's books could be quietly reshaped before anyone with real oversight noticed, needed a head chef who would not ask questions about food costs, waste percentages, or the strange gaps between what the kitchen ordered and what the kitchen used. Marcus Bennett, with his 18 years of meticulous cost tracking and his habit of noticing things, was exactly the kind of chef Voss did not want in his kitchen. So Voss buried the application. And when Eleanor Halston asked, weeks later, almost in passing, whether a Bennett had been considered for the position, Voss told her smoothly that the candidate had taken another offer. It was, like most things Voss said, a lie constructed to sound like an inconvenience rather than a decision. Eleanor let it go. She had, at the time, 4 other properties in crisis, a board that treated her competence as a standing question rather than a fact, and a father's company that she was still learning to hold with both hands. She did not let it go entirely. She simply filed it away, the way she filed most things Voss told her, in the growing folder, in her mind labeled things I will need to look at more closely when I have time. Marcus, for his part, moved on, the way people who have been disappointed before move on, tackier. He took smaller jobs. He kept the household running. He kept Amara in her school and her dance class on Tuesdays. In the small rituals of a stable life he had built for her out of nothing but discipline and love. And then, 10 weeks after his interview with Voss, an envelope arrived. It was not from the Halston Group's Human Resources Department. It was a personal note, handwritten, on lumen letterhead, informing Marcus that a table had been reserved for him and his daughter on the coming Friday evening. Compliments of the house, in recognition of his years in the industry. Marcus read it twice. He did not recognize the signature. It was initialed, not spelled out, a single flourish that told him nothing except that someone with authority had wanted him at that table. He almost did not go. He had learned over the years to be suspicious of unearned kindness from institutions that had never previously shown him any. But Amara had seen the envelope on the counter, had seen the words compliments of the house, and had asked, with the directness of a 7-year-old, whether they could go somewhere fancy for once. And Marcus, who had spent 7 years saying no to almost everything that cost more than it needed to, found that he did not have it in him to say no to this. He rented a car. He ironed his one good shirt. He braided Amara's hair properly this time, twice, until it was right. And on Friday evening he walked with his daughter to the glass doors of Lumen, gave his name to the maître, and was told in front of a room full of silent, watching strangers that he had the wrong address. The maître, explicitly, by Gerald Voss himself 2 days earlier, on which reservations to quietly misplace, did not know who Marcus Bennett was. He did not know about the interview, or the buried application, or the handwritten note. He knew only that Voss had told him, in the clipped tone of a man delivering an unpleasant but necessary instruction, that there might be a walk-in claiming a comp table, and that walk-ins claiming comp tables were, as a rule, not to be accommodated because comp tables were expensive and Voss did not authorize expensive things he had not personally approved. Voss had not been told by Eleanor that the reservation had come from her. He had simply assumed, because assuming the worst of people he considered beneath him was second nature to him, that anyone matching Marcus's description walking through that door was a problem to be managed, rather than a guest to be seated. So, Trevor Ainsley smiled his practice smile and told Marcus Bennett there was no reservation, and asked him, with a courtesy so thin it was barely a courtesy at all, to please step aside so he could attend to the guests who were actually expected. Marcus did not raise his voice. He had spent 18 years in kitchens, learning that the loudest person in the room is rarely the one who wins the argument. He looked down at Amara, whose face had gone carefully blank in the particular way children's faces go blank when they are absorbing an injustice they do not yet have words for, and he squeezed her hand once. "We'll go," he told her quietly. "It's all right." It was not all right, and it would not be all right for very much longer, though nobody in that dining room, including Marcus, understood that yet. Because at that exact moment, 40 feet away, behind the swinging doors that separated the dining room from the kitchen, the head chef of Lumen was plating a dish of seared scallops with brown butter and charred corn, and had just heard from a server passing through the words, "Guy at the door says his name is Bennett. Wants to make a scene about a reservation." Adrian Cole did not react. He rarely did, publicly. But something in the name landed in him like a stone dropped into still water, sending small, private ripples across a surface that otherwise gave nothing away. Adrian Cole was not a bad chef. That was in some ways the most complicated part of the truth. He had talent, real talent, the kind that had gotten him noticed in culinary school and fast-tracked into apprenticeships most cooks waited a decade for. What he did not have was the discipline Marcus Bennett had built over 18 years of running kitchens with no safety net, no family name, and no uncle on a board. Adrian had heard about Marcus Bennett before he ever took the job at Lumen. Heard about the four-table restaurant in Detroit. Heard, specifically from his uncle who sat on the Halston Group's board and who had mentioned once offhand that Eleanor Halston had asked pointed questions about a chef named Bennett before Adrian's hiring had gone through. Adrian had said nothing about it at the time. He had taken the job. He had told himself the way people tell themselves things they need to believe, that he had earned it, that the timing was simply unfortunate for whoever else had been in the running, that this was how the industry worked and always had. But standing in that kitchen, hearing a server say the name Bennett, Adrian Cole felt something he had been quietly suppressing for 10 weeks rise up all at once, and it did not feel like triumph. It felt like the particular cold guilt of a man who has always suspected, somewhere beneath his own justifications, that he was standing in a place that belonged to someone more deserving. He set down his plating spoon. He walked to the pass, looked through the small round window in the kitchen door, and saw a man in a gray coat holding a little girl's hand, already turning to leave, already absorbing the quiet, practiced dignity of someone who has been turned away from places before and has learned not to let it break his spine in public. Adrian recognized him immediately. He had seen a photograph once in an old restaurant write-up his uncle had shown him, half as a joke, half as a warning. This is the guy you almost lost the job to. And there he was, 40 feet away, being told by a 26-year-old in a bow tie that he did not belong. Adrian pushed through the kitchen doors. The dining room noticed him before he said a word. He was still in his chef's whites, a light dusting of flour on one forearm, and there was something in the set of his shoulders that made conversation stop the way they had stopped for Marcus, except this silence had a different texture to it. This was the silence of people recognizing that something important was about to happen. Adrian walked past the hostess stand. He walked past Trevor Ainsley, who turned, confused. "Chef, is everything all right?" And he did not answer. He walked directly to Marcus Bennett, who had reached the glass doors, whose hand was already on the handle, whose daughter was already looking back at the golden light of the dining room with the quiet, unspoken disappointment of a child who does not yet know how to be angry about unfairness, only sad about it. And Adrian Cole, head chef of Lumen, a man with his name on the door and his photograph on the restaurant's website, knelt down. Not to Amara, to Marcus. He knelt on one knee, in the middle of the dining room floor, in front of 140 covers of paying guests, in front of the maître d', who had just turned this man away, and he said loud enough for the room to hear, "Mr. Bennett, I am so sorry. This restaurant should have been yours." Nobody in the dining room moved. Marcus looked down at him, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, because he did not understand what he was looking at. A stranger in chef's whites, kneeling on a restaurant floor, apologizing for something Marcus did not yet have the context to make sense of. "I don't know what you mean," Marcus said finally. Adrian rose. His voice, when he spoke again, had steadied, but there was something raw underneath it. The sound of a man saying a true thing out loud for the first time after holding it in for too long. "You interviewed for this position 10 weeks ago. You should have gotten it. I got it instead because my uncle sits on the board of the company that owns this restaurant, and because the man who hired me buried your application, so it never got in front of the person who actually wanted you here." The maître d' Ainsley had gone pale. Standing several feet away with his reservation book still clutched in both hands like it might protect him. "Chef, I didn't know." "I know you didn't," Adrian said without looking at him. "That's not the point right now." He turned back to Marcus. "There's a woman in this restaurant tonight," Adrian said, "who I don't think knows you're standing in her lobby. And I think she needs to." Marcus did not know, in that moment, who Adrian meant. But 3 tables back, near the window, a woman in a dark green dress had set down her wine glass and was already rising from her seat. Because she had heard, across the sudden quiet of the dining room, a name she recognized. Eleanor Halston had come to Lumen that night unannounced, the way she often did with her properties, sitting quietly at a corner table under a name that was not her own, watching the room the way her father had taught her to watch a room. Not for what it wanted you to see, but for what it was trying not to show you. She had seen the maître d' turn away a man at the door. She had not yet had time to intervene before Adrian had beaten her to it, and something in the shape of what had just unfolded in front of her, the apology, the kneeling, the confession, spoken loudly enough for a room to hear, told her that the small, buried irritation she had felt with Gerald Voss 10 weeks earlier had just become something considerably larger. She walked toward them. "Mr. Bennett," she said, extending her hand. "My name is Eleanor Halston. I own this restaurant and every other property that carries my family's name. I think we have quite a bit to discuss, and I owe you an apology that is going to take longer than this dining room allows for." Marcus shook her hand. He did not smile. Not yet. Amara looked between the adults with the wide, careful eyes of a child, cataloging every detail of a story she would, decades later, still be telling her own children. "You're the one who sent the note," Marcus said. "It was not quite a question. I am." "Then you might want to know your maître d' didn't get the memo." It was the driest thing Marcus had said all evening, and it landed exactly the way understated things tend to land in rooms that have been holding their breath. Somewhere near the back a woman laughed, once sharply before catching herself. Eleanor did not laugh. But something in her face shifted, a kind of recognition, the particular respect one competent person feels on encountering another. "No," she said. "He did not get the memo. I intend to find out why." She turned to Trevor Ainsley. "Go find Gerald Voss. Tell him I need him here." Tonight Trevor did not move for a full second, the particular paralysis of a young employee realizing that the ground beneath an entire building has just shifted. Then he turned and walked quickly toward the back office. Eleanor turned back to Marcus. "Please," she said, "sit, both of you, as my guests. And, if you're willing, I would like to understand exactly what happened here tonight, and what happened 10 weeks ago. Because I do not think those two things are unrelated." They were not. Gerald Voss arrived at Lumen 40 minutes later, having been pulled from a dinner of his own across town. And the moment he stepped through the door and saw Eleanor Halston seated at a table with Marcus Bennett, he understood, with the particular clarity men like him reserve for moments of genuine danger, that something had gone very wrong. He did not, however, understand how badly. Voss was a man who had survived 11 years inside a company by being extremely good at reading rooms and adjusting his story to whatever the room seemed to require. He approached the table with the smooth, unbothered confidence of a man who believed he still had control of the narrative. "Eleanor, I got your message, and is everything all right?" "Sit down, Gerald." He sat. "This is Marcus Bennett," Eleanor said. "He interviewed for the head chef position here 10 weeks ago. I understand you conducted that interview personally." Voss's expression did not change, not visibly, though something in his posture recalibrated, the way a man's does when he realizes he is walking onto ground that has already been mapped by someone else. "I remember the name," Voss said carefully. "Talented candidate. We went another direction. Adrian had a stronger overall package, more experience with high-volume kitchens at this scale. He never worked a kitchen this size in his life," Adrian said. "Mint." He had pulled a chair over from an empty table and sat down, uninvited, his chef's whites still dusted with flour, his voice flat and even. I told you that in my own interview. You hired me anyway. Voss's eyes flicked to Adrian with something sharp and cold behind them, a warning that Adrian, for the first time in 10 weeks, did not flinch from. Adrian, I don't think this is the time. You told me his application never went through, Eleanor said. I asked you directly weeks ago whether a Bennett had applied. You told me he'd taken another offer. He had other opportunities being discussed at the time, I believe. I hadn't received a single other offer, Marcus said. It was the first thing he had said since Voss sat down, and it carried the same quiet, declarative weight as everything else he had said that night. I was working private events and consulting for a catering company in Southfield. I didn't have another restaurant courting me. I had one interview with you, and then silence. Voss's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. Perhaps there was a miscommunication somewhere in the hiring process. These things happen at scale, Eleanor. You understand that better than anyone. We're processing dozens of applications a week across 5 properties. Then, let's process this one now, Eleanor said. Where is his application, Gerald? I'd like to see the file. There was a pause, the kind of pause that, in a courtroom, would have been called damning. I'd have to check with human resources on the retention period for unsuccessful candidates, Voss said. We don't necessarily keep every file. You kept mine, Marcus said. Every head at the table turned toward him. Marcus reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn soft at the creases from having been carried and reread many times, and set it on the table. I kept a copy of everything I submitted. Cover letter, resume, references. A written statement of culinary philosophy, which was part of your application packet. By the way, an unusual requirement I remember because I spent 3 nights writing it. He looked at Eleanor. I also kept a copy of the confirmation email your recruiting coordinator sent me, acknowledging receipt of the application, time-stamped 10 weeks ago. He slid the paper across the table. Eleanor read it once. Then, in the manner of someone giving themselves time to fully absorb an unpleasant truth, rather than simply react to it, she read it again. This confirms your application was received and logged into the system, she said quietly. Which means it existed. Which means somebody made a decision not to forward it to the hiring committee. Which means, Gerald, that when I asked you directly whether a candidate named Bennett had applied, and you told me he'd received another offer, you were lying to me. Eleanor, I would never. You would, she said. You are. Right now. The dining room by this point had mostly stopped pretending not to watch. Servers moved more slowly between tables than they needed to. A few guests had genuinely stopped eating. Voss straightened his tie, a small, unconscious gesture, the physical equivalent of a man buying himself 2 seconds to construct his next sentence. I don't think it's productive to relitigate a hiring decision from 2.5 months ago in the middle of dinner service, he said. His voice smoothing back into the practiced, condescending calm he used in every meeting where he sensed the walls closing in. Adrian has been an excellent addition to this kitchen. Whatever happened in the hiring process, the restaurant has thrived under his leadership. Has it? Eleanor said. It was not a question. She reached into the small leather folio she had brought with her, the one she had, until that moment, intended to review privately at home later that week, and set a second document on the table. Food cost percentage for this location has run between 34 and 39% for the last 6 months, she said. Industry. Standard for a restaurant at this price point is 28 to 32. I asked our finance team to pull the numbers last month because the margins on this property have been the worst of all 5, and nobody could explain why. Adrian's expression, for the first time all evening, showed something other than guilt. It showed confusion. That's not possible, he said. I track waste percentages myself. Every week, we're running efficient. I run a tight kitchen. I believe you, Eleanor said, which is why I had someone look deeper. Vendor invoices don't match what's being logged in the kitchen inventory system. Somebody has been approving purchase orders for quantities well beyond what this kitchen actually receives, and the difference has been paid out, over 6 months, to a vendor account that traces back to a shell company registered at an address in Grosse Pointe. She looked directly at Voss. The same address, Gerald, as your brother-in-law's consulting business. The table went silent in a different way than before. Not the silence of a room watching a spectacle, the silence of a trap closing. Voss laughed once, a short, brittle sound with no humor in it at all. That's an absurd insinuation. I have no operational involvement in vendor selection for this property that's handled by the kitchen and the purchasing department. The purchase orders require a director-level signature for anything over $5,000, Eleanor said. I checked. Your signature is on 11 of them. She placed a third page on the table, a printed log with a column of small, looping signatures, Voss's own hand unmistakable, repeated 11 times beside 11 dates and $11 amounts that, added together, came to a little over $400,000 over 6 months. Marcus, watching this unfold, understood something in that moment that reframed the entire evening. He had assumed, standing at the door 2 hours earlier, that he had simply encountered ordinary cruelty, the kind he had absorbed his whole life and learned to walk away from with his dignity intact. What he was watching now was something else. He had walked, without knowing it, directly into the center of a much larger rod, one that had nothing to do with him personally and everything to do with a man who had built a small, quiet fraud into the bones of a restaurant and needed to keep anyone competent and observant far away from the kitchen books. That was, Marcus realized, the real reason his application had been buried, not because he lacked talent, because he had exactly the kind of meticulous, disciplined attention to cost and detail that would have caught this within a month. He almost said so out loud. He decided in the end that the numbers on the table were already saying it for him more clearly than he ever could. Eleanor closed the folio. Gerald, she said, you're suspended, effective immediately, pending a full audit of every property under your regional authority. I'll need your key card and your company phone before you leave this building tonight. Legal will be in touch about the rest. Voss's face had gone through several stages in the last 90 seconds. Confidence, irritation, calculation, and now, finally, something closer to fear, though he tried out of 11 years of habit to mask it with one last attempt at authority. You're making a serious mistake, Eleanor. I built the operational backbone of this company. Your father trusted me. My father, Eleanor said, trusted people who did not need to lie to a room full of witnesses to protect themselves. You just did that twice in the last 5 minutes. I don't need to see anything else. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Voss stood. He looked for a moment like he might say something further, some last practiced piece of corporate language designed to reframe his own downfall as a misunderstanding. But the room around him, the servers who had stopped moving, the guests who had stopped pretending not to listen, the man in the gray coat sitting with his daughter at the table beside him, offered him nothing to work with. There was no audience left willing to believe him. He left without another word. The dining room did not immediately return to its usual murmur. It took a while, the way a held breath takes a while to fully release. Eleanor watched him go, and then turned back to the table, to Marcus, to Amara, who had been quietly eating a plate of scallops that Adrian had brought her without anyone quite noticing when. I owe you a job offer, Eleanor said to Marcus. That should have been made 10 weeks ago. I'd like to make it properly this time. Head chef of Lumen. Full creative authority over the kitchen. And, given everything that just happened here, a considerably better starting figure than what was originally on the table. And my personal commitment that nothing like tonight happens in one of my restaurants again. Marcus looked at Adrian. What happens to him? It was a fair question, and one Eleanor had clearly not yet fully worked through. Adrian answered it himself. I'd leave, he said quietly. I don't think I can stay in a kitchen that was supposed to be yours. Not with a clear conscience. Marcus considered this for a long moment. You knelt down in front of a room full of people and told the truth when it would have been easier not to, he said finally. That's not nothing. Most people in this industry wouldn't have done that. It doesn't undo what happened. No, Marcus agreed. It doesn't. But it's the difference between a man who benefited from something wrong and did nothing, and a man who benefited from something wrong and corrected it the moment he understood what he was standing on. I've worked with a lot of the first kind, not many of the second. He looked at Eleanor. I'll take the job, on one condition. Name it. Adrian stays on as sous chef if he wants it. Somebody who's willing to kneel on a dining room floor and tell an uncomfortable truth in front of a room of paying customers is somebody I can build a kitchen with. Tay. I'd rather have him learning under me than gone entirely. Eleanor looked between the two men, something like genuine surprise crossing her face, quickly replaced by the same quiet respect she had felt earlier, deepening now into something closer to certainty. That's your call to make, she said. As of tonight, this is your kitchen. Adrian did not say anything immediately. When he did, his voice was rougher than it had been all evening. Thank you, he said. I won't waste it. See that you don't, Marcus said. And there was no warmth in it yet, but there was no cruelty either. It was simply a fact stated plainly the way Marcus stated most things. The audit that followed, over the next several weeks, confirmed everything the initial numbers had suggested, and then some. Gerald Voss had, over roughly 4 years, quietly diverted just under $1.6 million across 3 properties through a network of shell vendors and inflated purchase orders, exploiting exactly the kind of unquestioning trust that a founder's daughter, newly installed and still finding her footing, had extended to a man who had made himself indispensable by design. He was terminated formally within the month, and the matter was handed to the company's legal team and eventually to prosecutors. Eleanor Halston used the incident, uncomfortable as it was, as the foundation for a broader overhaul of the company's internal financial oversight. Installing an independent auditing structure that reported directly to her rather than through regional directors who had, until now, effectively graded their own homework, she would later say. In an interview she gave reluctantly, and only because the story had by then become impossible to fully contain, that the worst thing about the Voss situation was not the money. It was how long it had gone unnoticed simply because nobody with authority had been paying close enough attention, and how close the company had come to losing a chef of Marcus Bennett's caliber over exactly that same inattention. Marcus took over the kitchen at Lumen 2 weeks later. He ran it the way he had run every kitchen he had ever led, with a level of discipline that made junior cooks nervous for the first month and grateful for every month after. He tracked every ounce of waste. He tasted every dish that left the pass. He kept a small, dog-eared notebook in his coat pocket, the same habit he had carried since his dishwashing days in Cleveland, in which he wrote down anything worth remembering: a supplier's name, a substitution that worked better than expected, a compliment from a guest that meant something. Adrian stayed on as sous chef. It was not, in the beginning, an easy dynamic. There was a formality between them for the first several weeks, a careful, deliberate politeness that came from both men working hard not to let the shadow of how they'd met define everything that came after. But Adrian was, underneath the mistakes of his hiring, genuinely talented, and Marcus was, underneath his caution, genuinely generous. With anyone who worked honestly and slowly, over months, something like real trust began to grow between them, the kind built the only way real trust is ever built, through the accumulation of small, consistent proof. Lumen's food cost percentage dropped to 29% within its first quarter under Marcus's leadership. Its reviews, which had been merely good under Adrian's original run, became something closer to reverent within 6 months, several critics specifically noting the return of a kind of disciplined, patient technique that had apparently been missing without anyone quite being able to say why. Eleanor Halston visited the restaurant often, more often. She was honest with herself than any single property strictly required. She would sit at the same corner table she had claimed on the night everything changed, and Marcus would occasionally come out from the kitchen between courses to check on her table personally, a habit he extended to almost no one else, and they would talk, briefly, about food, about the business, about the strange, particular pressure of being underestimated by people who had never bothered to look closely enough to know better. It was on one of these evenings, roughly 8 months after the night at the door, that Eleanor asked him, over what had become a fairly standard glass of wine after service, whether he had ever considered a larger role within the company. Regional oversight of culinary standards across all 5 properties. A voice and decisions that, until recently, had been made entirely without anyone like him in the room. Marcus considered it the way he considered most things, slowly and out loud. "I'd take it," he said, "on one condition. I keep this kitchen. I'm not interested in a desk job that pulls me away from a stove and a set of guests I can actually cook for. If I'm going to have a voice in how 5 kitchens run, I want it to come from somebody who's still standing in one of them every night, not somebody who used to." Eleanor smiled, the first real, unguarded smile Marcus had seen from her. "That," she said, "is exactly the answer I was hoping you'd give." They created the role together over the following weeks. An unusual position with no clean precedent in the company's structure, something between an executive chef and an independent quality auditor, reporting directly to Eleanor with the explicit authority to walk into any Halston Group kitchen, done announced, and flag anything that did not meet the standard Marcus Bennett had spent 18 years building in his own head. It was, Eleanor noted privately, not entirely unlike the audit structure she'd installed on the financial side after Voss. A permanent check built into the company's foundation, this time made of somebody's actual expertise rather than a spreadsheet. Amara, for her part, had opinions about all of this that she shared freely and often. She had, in the 8 months since the night at the door, become something of an unofficial fixture at Lumen, doing her homework at a small table near the kitchen's pass most Tuesday and Thursday evenings, while her father worked service, occasionally emerging to offer critique on new dishes with the blunt, unfiltered honesty only a 7, now 8-year-old could get away with delivering to a professional kitchen staff. "The corn thing needs more salt," she told Adrian once with total confidence, and Adrian, who by then had learned to trust her palate nearly as much as her father's, had actually gone back and adjusted the seasoning. On the 1-year anniversary of the night Marcus had been turned away at Lumen's door, Eleanor closed the restaurant to the public for a single evening and hosted a small, private dinner instead. Just Marcus, Amara, Adrian, and herself at the same corner table where she had once sat alone, unnoticed, eating his food for the first time 3 years before anyone in that dining room understood what it would eventually cost and give to bring him through that door for good. Marcus cooked the meal himself, the same braised short rib he had served her that night in Detroit, and when he set the plate down in front of her, he did not say anything about it, and neither did she. Some things did not need to be spoken aloud to be understood between two people who had both, in their own ways, learned exactly how much could be lost by looking away from what was right in front of them. Amara, sitting between them with her own smaller plate, looked between her father and Eleanor with the particular, unhurried patience of a child who has already decided how a story is going to end and is simply waiting, contentedly, for the adults to catch up. "Are you going to be here every Tuesday now?" she asked Eleanor, matter-of-factly over dessert. Eleanor glanced at Marcus, who suddenly seemed very interested in the tablecloth. "I might be," Eleanor said. "Good," Amara said, and went back to her plate satisfied, as if the matter had been settled definitively, and in every way that mattered, it had.